Hey man, don't forget it's your turn to host game night. Ichiro called after Katsuki as he slung his bag over one shoulder and headed for the door. His best friend paused in the doorway of the locker rooms at their hero agency, turning to give an apologetic look to Ichiro, who had caught up to him at this point.
Oh fuck, I knew I forgot something.
He scrubbed a hand through his hair with a sigh, moving down the hallway, Ichiro falling into step beside him.
I took the week off for,
Ichiro felt his face heat as realization struck him.
Ah shit, it's rut season, isn't it?
By law, hero agencies were required to offer 1 week of vacation time specifically to allow pro-heroes to fulfill their biological imperatives. Most agencies scheduled these breaks during peak fertility season, since anyone without a bond mate was required to fulfill their obligation to society or else fill out reams of paperwork explaining why they would not be siring a child. Many pro-heroes opted for the paperwork, since being bond-mated was hard to manage in their line of work. Even so, upon reaching the age of majority, it was considered a social obligation to mate. Of course, that social obligation only extended to mating when the pairings had the potential for offspring. That being the case, alpha-omega and beta-beta matings were the most highly encouraged combinations, though beta women could bear children as well as any omega, so mating an alpha with a child-bearing beta, or a male beta with an omega, was not an unheard of practice. Society did not look kindly upon mates who could not bear children. While alpha-alpha and omega-omega couples certainly existed, the stigma was very real and could run a pro-hero's career if such perverse desires were to be uncovered. That's why Ichiro never told Katsuki how he felt. Besides, the man had never shown any interest in Ichiro. He was a proper alpha. Well, he was still Bakugou, but time as a pro-hero had somewhat mellowed his abrasive personality. He always took his rut season break once a year, never came back with any bond marks that Ichiro could see, but he always smelled faintly of himself with an undertone of sweet omega arousal hovering at the edge of his scent. Ichiro didn't know if Katsuki had a favorite omega at a heat house, or if he was secretly dating an omega and just refused to introduce them. It didn't really matter. It hurt to think about either way, because it meant Bakugou wasn't like Ichiro. He wasn't holding himself back, filling out that damn paperwork year after year, pining for another alpha instead of getting with the program and visiting a heat house. Which wasn't to say Ichiro hadn't tried to visit heat houses. He just couldn't stand the cloying sweetness of multiple omegas trying to reel him in. He didn't want that, didn't want any of them. He probably could have tried a beta woman, but Ichiro was pretty positive he preferred Bakugou for a reason. And a childbearing beta woman wouldn't have all the necessary equipment to really get his motor running, so to speak. Which is it for you? Ichiro heard himself asking. Paperwork or mating? Katsuki made a face. When would I find the time to meet someone I could stand to have around me for a whole week? He rolled his eyes. Paperwork's easier than dealing with human company, plus I get a week all to myself. Kirishima nodded, humming sympathetically, shoving down his internal protest that Bakugou was obviously spending his rep with someone, whether he was willing to admit it or not. He had no right to demand answers from Bakugou, and there was no right way to explain that he knew Bakugou's scent on such a visceral, obsessive level that he could smell the omega on him when he got back from his rut. Tell me about it. I keep trying to visit heat houses, but... He grimaced. I really don't understand the appeal of omegas, he stated. Katsuki shrugged. Yeah, well, there's always betas, he said. I just don't like to share my space with fucking strangers. You ever think about how fucking weird it is, just taking some random-ass person home with you to try and make a baby? Ichiro nodded. Yeah, that's why I've never been able to go through with it, he said carefully. Well, that and the, yeah, you and your fucking stupid omega hang up, Katsuki said with fond exasperation. You're the only alpha I've ever met who's genuinely disinterested in omegas. That's because I'm too busy being wildly interested in an alpha I work alongside, Ichiro thought, forcing a weak laugh. Yeah, one of these days I expect they're just gonna lock me in a room with some omega and wait till something happens. Fuck, I'd rather have someone just knock me out and take what they wanted. At least then I wouldn't be stuck making small talk with someone who's expected to be jumping my bones, Bakugou declared. Ichiro shrugged. I guess it could be worse. I heard Omegas can be forcibly placed in a heat house for the duration of their season if they haven't mated for a number of years. Katsuki slowed his walk to a halt. Yeah, he said, a sharp edge to his tone that Ichiro couldn't quite place. It's fucking bullshit. All of it, Ichiro agreed. Man, I hate rut season. Katsuki glared at the letter in his hand, like if he willed it to vanish hard enough, maybe it would. No such luck. The official letterhead stared up at him accusingly. He'd gone too many rut seasons without finding a mate, and now he'd been given the official word. This rut season was to be spent in a fucking heat house. The government couldn't outright make him have sex, but damn if those wily bastards didn't think up all sorts of clever ways to make it the simplest solution for an unbonded Omega looking for somewhere to go through heat. Bakugou glowered at the document in his hands, informing him that a room was waiting for him at the Gentle Embrace, a local heat house that contracted with the city government to take in a certain quota of mandatory residents, in addition to the number of Omegas who came willingly, with hopes of meeting their future bondmate or some shit. Katsuki was a realist, not a romantic. He knew the government could put him in a heat house, but they couldn't make him go home with an alpha, just like Katsuki couldn't make Ichiro like Omegas. It was just his fucking luck. The one alpha that Katsuki could genuinely consider taking home was the only alpha he'd ever met that showed no interest whatsoever in Omegas. Ichiro didn't hate Omegas. He just was very frank about the fact that Omegas held no interest for him. He couldn't say it outright, but Bakugou had been his friend long enough to see the way Ichiro fixated on manliness and power, and had long since puzzled out the subtext of his admiration. The man was into other alphas, and as much as he loathed to admit it, Katsuki was not a fucking alpha. He was a damn Omega, an Omega being forced to spend his heat around a bunch of other simpering Omegas. He wondered if it would be against the rules to just hit his head against a wall until he passed out and couldn't fulfill his socializing duties at the heat house. Then again, who was to say there wouldn't be some creepy-ass alpha lurking around who happened to get off on fucking unconscious Omegas? It wasn't a viable option. Fortunately, there didn't seem to be a rule against alcohol, so Katsuki decided his best option might be a bottle of something hard enough to make him forget about how fucking pissed off he was over the whole damn ordeal. Sighing, he shoved a few outfits into his duffel bag. He didn't bother to see if they were nice clothes, or if they even matched. He wasn't actually trying to get anyone's attention, so he didn't give a fuck about his clothes. He just needed something to wear so he wasn't parading around the heat house stark naked, though he'd heard that was apparently a viable strategy for some Omegas. God, he hoped that had been an exaggeration. He picked up his bottle of suppressants and contemplated it, a scowl crossing his fingers as he did so. Katsuki had a feeling they would confiscate these at the door. Legally, heat houses couldn't deprive residents of suppressants, but practically speaking, suppressants often got misplaced, leading to unexpected Omega heats and by extension, more matings. Since heat houses operated specifically to function as a neutral location for alphas to find Omegas who wanted sex, it made sense that they would discourage the use of suppressants among the Omega residents. Unlike most Omegas, though, Katsuki only had his heat once a year. It pissed off his doctor to no end, since it meant that his heat was always a doozy. Katsuki would usually spend a good 2/3 of it with what was probably his entire fucking fist up his ass, begging for a knot he knew wasn't there, and generally making a mess of himself. It wasn't pretty, and there was no chance in hell he was going to let that shit go down in a fucking heat house. He'd just have to take his suppressants. After some consideration, he broke the suppressants up in 2-day doses and packed a 2-week supply instead of a 1-week, just in case someone found one of the 2 bundles of stashed pills. He sighed to himself as he tucked the pills into various pockets and pouches. He would just have to wait until next year to go into heat. His doctor was going to be pissed, but Katsuki would rather face the wrath of his primary care physician than a week in desperate, sloppy heat surrounded by unfamiliar alphas who just wanted to get their dicks wet. That done, he took a quick look around his apartment, wondering if he'd forgotten anything. Once he checked into the heat house, he wouldn't be able to leave unless he was accompanied by a visiting alpha, or his week was up. Food and board would be provided. Katsuki's tax dollars at work wasn't government wonderful. and the brochure included that his letter had implied that there was a wide selection of movies, video games, board games, and an extensive library offered by the Gentle Embrace to entertain Omegas waiting to be approached by horny-ass alphas. The brochure said nothing about a fully stocked bar, though, so Katsuki resolved to drop by a liquor store on his way over. With the way this week was shaping up, he had a feeling he'd need at least one full bottle of the strong stuff to make it through. Katsuki sighed, locking his door behind him as he headed out. Rut season really was the fucking worst. Kirishima's own rut break was scheduled to begin halfway through Bakugou's week off, and he was dreading the time he would spend alone already. He'd been called out by 2 separate co-workers already today for moping, but he couldn't help it. He missed Katsuki, and he hated that every time he turned to make a smart remark and realized he wasn't there, he'd suddenly be reminded that his friend was probably not deep in some Omega by now. It hurt more than he was willing to admit, which was made worse by the fact that he couldn't even explain to anyone why he was upset. There was nothing wrong with Bakugou mating in Omega. Ichiro was the one with a weird hang-up, not his friend. He hoped Katsuki was at least having a better time than he was, though a part of him hoped that Katsuki missed him as much as he did. He sighed, staring down at his lunchbox with dismay. "Staring won't make it taste any better," Dinky commented, sinking into the seat across from Kirishima with a sympathetic glance. "I know," Kirishima sighed. You miss your boyfriend," Dinky teased, and the word sent a little pang through Kirishima's chest. If only that were true. "Shut up." Kirishima tried to grin, finally taking a bite of his lunch. "You miss him too." "Yeah? But I'm not the one staring at my lunch while sitting alone in the corner of the cafeteria," Dinky pointed out. "This was high school, Monama'd be all over you by now." Kirishima chuckled. "Oh, ho, ho. Class A doesn't know how to cope with being separated from a friend? My, how pathetic," he mockingly improvised. Dinky snickered. What a jerk, he remembered, before adding with a half-grimace. "I'm glad he's not in the same agency as us, though. I get the feeling he's not the type to let go of old-school rivalries." Kirishima laughed. "Neither are we, considering none of us can stand the guy, even 7 years after graduating." Dinky shrugged. "What can I say? He's an asshole, and not even a lovable sort of jerk like Bakugou." "Yeah," Ichiro agreed, his mind wandering back to Katsuki. Where was he right then? Probably at a heat house romancing some Omega. He frowned, quickly shoveling food into his mouth. He didn't want to think about it anymore.
"Welcome to the Gentle Embrace, sir. Are you here for a specific resident or looking to find a partner?"
The receptionist looked Katsuki up and down appreciatively as she spoke. He could practically hear her thoughts buzzing around, wondering what such a good-looking alpha was doing at an admittedly mid to low-range heat house instead of at some fancier establishment. Boy, was she in for a surprise. "I'm here for my mandatory week of residence," Katsuki told her briskly, handing over his letter. Her eyes widened and she stuttered a little. Oh, mandatory residence, of course." She glanced at the letter, looked at Katsuki, stared at the letter again, then in a small voice asked, "May I see your ID, please?" Katsuki dug out his wallet and passed her his identification card without complaint. She compared it to the letter, frowned slightly, then handed both the card and letter back to Bakugou. "We'll have your room ready in just a few minutes," she said. Katsuki noticed with detached interest that she was no longer calling him sir. Typical. "If you'd like to have a seat, I can get you something to drink. Would you like some tea or coffee?" Katsuki considered the offer. "Coffee," he decided, moving across the empty lobby and dropping bonelessly into an uncomfortable chair. He sighed heavily, watching her scurry away to bring him his steaming hot bean water. The caffeine probably wouldn't do much for his impending stress headache, but at least it was something to occupy himself with while he waited for his room to be readied. He scowled at the few magazines scattered about on low tables around the lobby, noting with detached interest that the magazine nearest him had his own face on it. Obscured by a mask, of course, but still his face. Fucking hell. Some days he wished he'd gone for a full visor or helmet as part of his hero get-up, just to ensure more anonymity. Expelling a puff of air through his lips in an exaggerated sigh, He turned the magazine over so his own face wasn't staring up at him accusingly. He accepted the cup of coffee with a grunt when the receptionist handed it to him. She looked positively scandalized by the whole proceeding. Not only did he have the muscular build of an alpha, he had the brusque nature of one too. Since he was always on suppressants, no one could really pick up a decent scent from him one way or another, so people tended to assume. Well, Bakugou didn't really care what people thought anyway, except... fuck. Knowing he was an Omega didn't usually bother him, but lately he found himself wondering what might be possible if only Kirishima were remotely interested in Omegas. A useless question, and Katsuki had pretty much resigned himself to a life of self-imposed celibacy by now. He scowled into his coffee cup, only glancing up when he heard someone else enter. He was plain and almost painfully nondescript. Dark brown hair, dark eyes, and pale skin with a few dusky pink acne scars on his cheeks. He was average height and thin, but not wiry. He glanced around, his eyes landing on Katsuki for a moment. Their gazes locked, and the man blanched, quickly turning to the counter.
Hi.
He greeted the receptionist hesitantly. She looked up from her computer, a bland smile plastered across her face.
Welcome to the Gentle Embrace, sir. Are you here for a specific resident or looking to find a partner?
Looking.
The man stuttered, darting a glance in Katsuki's direction. It was painfully obvious that he was worried the residents might be out of his league if someone like Katsuki was his competition. Little did he know.
If you could just fill out this form, you'll be all set,
the receptionist said, politely not commenting on the young man's nervousness as she passed him a clipboard.
Feel free to take a seat while you fill it out.
The young man nodded jerkily, then glanced around the lobby. His gaze landed on Katsuki once more, and he walked over, plopped into the seat next to Katsuki.
Hey,
he greeted Katsuki, turning to face him with a weak smile. Katsuki took a long-ass sip of coffee before he moved only his eyes to look at the guy seated beside him. He grunted in acknowledgement and looked away again. Despite his nerves, the guy seemed determined to start a conversation, writing 2 things on his paperwork form before trying again.
I'm Adachi Keita. Is this your first visit?
God damn it. Katsuki had hoped he could at least avoid socializing before checking into this fucking whorehouse, but no, apparently that wasn't in the cards for him.
Bakugou Katsuki. First and hopefully last visit.
The guy's eyes widened a little.
Oh, you're looking for a bondmate. Wow.
No, Katsuki clarified.
Just doing my civic duty and getting the hell out of Dodge.
The guy laughed nervously, scratching a few words on his document before looking up and saying,
I guess that's good news for me anyway. Less competition.
He flashed a self-deprecating smile at Bakugou, but Katsuki was too busy wrinkling his nose at what Boring Face had said to really notice.
What the fuck? You scared of a little competition?
Katsuki could hardly imagine that sort of reaction. Being outclassed usually pissed him off. It didn't make Katsuki any less inclined to try. What a defeatist attitude. No wonder this sorry excuse for an alpha was stuck wandering through lowbrow heat houses trying to meet someone. He was a fucking coward.
I don't think I have much of a chance if I'm competing with guys like you,
Adachi pointed out.
Yeah, well, lucky for you, we definitely won't be competing,
Katsuki replied, ignoring the surprised look Adachi shot his way at the comment. Just then, a young man with a pleasant, though not necessarily handsome face poked his head into the lobby.
Mr. Bakugou, your room is ready for you.
He looked expectantly at Adachi, only to frown in confusion when Adachi stared right back at him. The young man's eyebrows shot up his forehead when he saw Katsuki's large form rising from his chair.
Great,
Bakugou said in a tone that indicated a complete lack of sincerity.
Lead the way.
He saw Adachi gape at him as he exited the room, and noted him hurriedly scuttling across the room to ask the receptionist about the well-built man who was just leaving.
Bakugou's a new resident,
Katsuki heard the receptionist answer.
He'll be here for the next week.
Then the man who had called Katsuki out of the lobby shut the door behind them, and Katsuki could no longer make out the words being exchanged. He glanced at the guy, a bleached blonde with his roots beginning to show right at his hairline. The guy was staring back at him.
You must get this a lot, but...
The young man swallowed hard.
You look a lot like Ground Zero.
Bakugou rolled his eyes.
That's because I fucking am Ground Zero.
he informed the attendant, who stopped in the middle of the hallway and gaped at him. His mouth was big, a little too big for comfort, in an uncanny valley sort of way. Maybe it had something to do with the guy's quirk. Kotsky didn't really care to find out. "Oh my god," the man whispered, then did a double take. "But you're an Omega. Oh my god." His voice rose to a shrill note that hurt Bakugou's ears and did nothing for his building headache. "You're a pro-hero and an Omega, but why are you here? You could go anywhere." Bakugou shifted his duffel bag to his other shoulder. "I don't want to go fucking anywhere. Mandatory residence, remember?" The young man stiffened, as though suddenly remembering his professionalism. "Right. Terribly sorry, sir. This way, if you wouldn't mind." He gestured down a hallway before beginning to walk, obviously expecting Kotsky to follow. With a sigh, Bakugou did just that. Fucking rut season.